Hi everyone, welcome. We're down here in my wormery, and we're going to check in today on my newest worm bin, which is all the way over here on the right. All my oldest stuff is on to the left. Over here on the far right is where the newest stuff is. I got a few bits of info to share with you about the system. Like I said, it's my newest bin, so it's not very old, only 18 days of age. And we actually let the system go a whole week after it had been launched, and then we gave it its first feeding. So today it'll only be getting its second feeding on day 18. The systems that we took the worms out of, there was actually 2 bins worth of worms used to launch this one system. And sometimes, like I do occasionally, I hang on to the castings from a completed system or from completed systems and hang on to their castings in the interest of possibly letting some cocoons that might have been left behind hatch so that the babies that emerge from those cocoons can be rounded up, or perhaps more so in the case of this bin, the assumption that a number of stragglers were probably left behind. So what I've got going on over here beneath all this stuff is a bait box. A bait box into which I placed some food and bedding and moisture in the hopes that eventually the worms will gather in that little box so they can be extracted. We did actually check in here a week ago and sort of aerate the material, make sure that it's got a fair chance to dry off, because I figure as the castings begin drying off, the worms will be more inclined to exit the material so they can be rounded up in that little bait box. So before we get on to feeding the new 18-day-old system, we're just going to do a quick check-in on the cocoon nursery and the stragglers. So I'm going to slip on a glove, get the bins out on the bench, and we're going to get to work. You know, in the past when I've run systems like this to just give the castings a chance to dry and give the worms a chance to move out, a lot of times I find that it does take a little while for the castings to dry out to the point where it seems like the worms don't want to be in the stuff. And it does help a lot if I come in and I aerate the material on a pretty regular basis. So I sometimes tell myself I should come in here prior to the next check-in and feeding of the main bin to just give this stuff a stir, but I somehow never get around to doing it. So the last check-in on this system was the same time as when we fed the main box with the relocated worms in it. And I didn't really rewatch the old video from last time, but I did check my notes, and it did say that we did put food in here last time. I feel a good bit of moisture, and man, there's a lot of springtails hanging out over here in this stuff. I don't see anything that resembles food. I don't recall exactly what would have been placed in here as the food, but I do see a good number of worms hanging out here and there. Lots of springtails, good number of worms, and I never really know exactly how many worms might have been left behind in the castings when I bring a system to its end. I think the real telltale is not how many worms turned out, it's more about how many worms still remain in the castings. Man, so many springtails hanging out here. I don't know, somehow certain systems of mine just seem to have become very heavily loaded with springtails. But before we close this bin up, I'm thinking as long as I've got this pile of food here to feed the other system with, why don't we just grab a handful and toss it in here. I mean, all this bedding that they've got is in itself decent food that the worms can nibble on. And the moisture itself is probably what they're more drawn to as the castings that they're in out in the bin dries further and further off. Because as you might have noticed, the only thing covered with plastic was this middle section. Everything else is covered with only paper, allowing for good drying. So I just threw in a number of frozen veggies. Those veggies will thaw out and be nice and soft and easy for the worms to eat. So if they want to eat that, they can eat that. If they want to nibble on the bedding, on the paper, that's fine too. And I mean, the moisture is good too, but you know what? As long as I've got my little spray bottle here with the BTI solution in it, I just figure we can actually dump in a little bit of extra moisture. Not that it even really needs it, but as long as it's open and I'm working on it here, feeding it, might as well just increase the appeal of it by further dampening it a little bit. And I don't think it, like I said earlier, I don't think it necessarily needs it because everything had a good moisture content to it. I think hence the springtails. But we don't have to go overboard. That'll be enough. Let's leave it at that. So let's let's proceed to examining the material in the bin outside of the bait box. Might as well get these little guys over into the collection area as well, as long as they're right there within view. I guess this will really only run until the point where we finally come back in here at some point, look through the material and find no worms hanging out in it. At that point we'll know that all the worms have gradually made their way over into the bait box. I mean, if I do bump into one, we can always grab them. I don't know how many we're going to encounter, but it always does seem to me like we're going to be doing a pretty good job of kind of kickstarting the movement of the worms out of the material by stirring it all together, because even though there might be nice damp stuff here and there, perhaps down low, by taking all this dry stuff that's on the surface and combining it throughout, we'll just, you know, almost instantly drop the moisture level of the entire contents of the container, inspiring any straggler worms to further seek out more comfortable places to be. So I don't know, I'm not really going out of my way to spot worms and pull them out. I did see a few, but I didn't really bother to try to nip them out. There's another one, but you know, let's not worry so much about trying to individually pick worms out. I guess if it's really convenient and they're right out on the surface, we can grab them, we can always pull them out. But really my main idea for this was to get all the dry stuff blended in. Oh, there's a lot of worms over down here, down low. So it would take a lot of time to, you know, individually pull these little straggler worms out. Just based on the size of these worms, I would have to assume that they were not born from cocoons here. They're just worms that were sort of left behind when I emptied the two systems from which all these castings were taken from. And these are mainly stragglers. Some of them could just be worms that were born here within this bin, but my guess is that the majority of them are just stragglers. And just by doing what we're doing here, I think we're going to create an environment that the worms are going to now feel further motivated to leave. Presumably, at some point, making their way up to the surface to find something a little bit more hospitable, a little bit more comfortable. And then they'll most likely stumble on that bait box. They'll find a whole bunch of yummy foods in there, some nice bedding to hang out in, moisture, which is probably the main thing that they're going to be on the lookout for once they start to feel the encroachment of drying and more dry material surrounding them suddenly. And this is almost identical to the way I handled the extraction of the worms out of my last harvested batch of castings too. I just gradually helped the material get drier and drier by stirring it a few times, and eventually I went in there and found absolutely no worms anywhere within the castings. They all eventually got to the point where they just didn't want to be in this stuff anymore because it had gotten so dry that they really all just went on the move, and they went out and they found themselves at the bait box. And at that point it was, you know, as far as I could tell, it was pretty much a 100% extraction of all the straggler worms. And I guess just with the additional time, we might even be permitting a few babies to hatch out of their cocoons and remain with the rest of the family. I mean, here and there you see a little baby worm. I don't know, 18-day-old worm, probably not. It looks a little bit bigger than that, but either way, I think that was pretty much the game plan for here. So I'm gonna just try to gradually level things off, backfill the material, because the container has little holes on the edge too, around the perimeter, so they can either come up directly from below up into the holes that are on the bottom of the container, or they can even enter from the side, or even crawl over the top if they want, around the over the edge into the collection box. And I don't know, I think it took 30 days, 31 days last time, so if I were to probably come back in here once or twice more, continuing to stir the material and further kind of souring the what's the expression, souring the milk or something like that, sort of, you know, giving the worms motivation to leave, I think we'll eventually find ourselves with a batch of really nice, pretty much 100% depopulated castings. So I think we've done what we came to do in here, in this container. So I'm just going to return the, how did this go again? I can't remember. This might have just been here to prevent the plastic from dropping in, but the plastic is really sort of meant to force the moisture to remain down in the bait box and not sneak out. And it seems like it's been doing a good job just based on what the material felt like, so that's pretty cool. But I think that's pretty much where we're at. Why don't we return this system to the shelf and get the bin that needs to be fed out here. It's hardly noticeable, but this is the larger size bus bin that I've got. The system that we just looked at is very similar in size to this as far as its depth and its, I don't know, its length, I guess, but its width is where they differ. This is a little bit wider. I got a few of these somewhat larger sized bins, but most of my systems are the size that we just saw the cocoon nursery going on in, or straggler box, or whatever you want to refer to it as. I just saw a couple worms hanging out here on the plastic. I thought I'd try to pull them off before we set this aside and send the little wormies into a panic by being out in the bright lights and dry air. But I guess we'll pile the top covering pieces of paper onto here too and stuff to sort of give them a little bit of comfort until we finish feeding and getting stuff restored to the way it was before we came in to intrude on their privacy. Here too I can see some springtails hanging out. Oh well, it is what it is. And here we've got a coffee filter which would have been rested out onto the surface here after our last feeding to indicate to ourselves where we last fed. Doesn't seem like there's a whole lot left of that coffee filter, does it? And well, you know, I don't have any coffee for the worms today, so I don't even know if it's worthwhile to try to keep this around as a feeding zone indicator. If we do, it's just going to be gone by the next time we check in here. So perhaps on this go around, we'll simply forego giving them a feeding zone indicator, and we'll just take our chances next time on hopefully finding where we last fed when we come back in here. No, I mean, for me, the feeding zone indicator is just a little bit of a tradition. There was one stat on my little information board that we sort of glossed over, a couple actually. One of them is the worm count. So I think I might have hinted at the worm count last time, but I didn't really come in with what we had all arrived at together, which is at this point 3218. I don't think I've seen any recent estimates provided in the comments of the video from 2 times ago when we originally launched this system 18 days ago. So at this point I'm assuming that that number is going to pretty much settle in at that, unless anybody watches that launch video from when we bought all the worms from those 2 retired systems and placed all the worms into here. It is always fun to gather everyone's estimates to find out what people think in terms of how many worms we launched the system with. So I have a kind of a funny looking object in here. Some of you might have been looking at that thinking, what the heck is that? So it's one of those little decorative pumpkins that you buy at Halloween time. I don't know if they're really the type of thing that anyone would ever would be purchasing for the purposes of eating it or anything like that. I think they're really sold as just sort of a decoration. It's kind of weird too, because this outer skin of it is sort of peeling off. I'm not that familiar with these things. I mean, I never, oops. I'm going to see about trying to avoid doing that. I just chipped a little piece of one of these fins off, and now I can actually see down into the thing. And it might even look like from over here there's access to the inside of it. I'm not sure if maybe this thing's hollow or something. It does seem that way. Look at that, just the way it flexes. Oh, I'm being a little bit more rough with this than I would want to be. I'd rather just see how that thing on its own, breaks down or deteriorates. But I'm almost wondering just the way that outer color is peeling off. I mean, what do they paint these things and they sell them painted to make them look more interesting or something? Or is that just some sort of outer skin that's peeling off by being, I don't know, exposed to moisture down in the worm bin? I'm not that familiar with what these little gourds are like. You know, I don't really normally have them around or feed them to my worms, so this is actually my first time trying those. I got a couple of them actually, so eventually I'll probably start adding those to other worm bins of mine, but for now this is the only system that I've got so far that has one of those in it. And as you can see, I'm really limited on how much room I have to excavate here as far as a place to put any of the stuff that I pull out of the hole. So I'm trying to be really careful so that I don't end up shoving a whole bunch of this material over the edge and onto the floor and everywhere else. So I'm going to see about being kind of careful. I'm starting to encounter some old bits of tougher materials that probably came over with the worms from their old environment. One of them right here is a pumpkin stem. A little bit of a pumpkin stem. It would have probably been much larger originally, but that just happens over time. It just deteriorates and breaks down. The other thing I'm kind of curious of is something I don't remember seeing when the system was launched or during the last check-in either, but it's probably in here somewhere, which is an item that's been floating around in a few of my systems for some time now. It's the cork. So I know the cork was in one of the two bins that we bought an end to when we bought the worms over here, and I'm just kind of on the lookout to see if it'll turn up. So hopefully we'll bump into it here today. Look at all those wormies. Tell you, these are some lively worms. They just vanished out of view, 1, 2, 3. But most of them are probably still right here in my hand. I don't think I even saw one drop off my hand. They all just want to get out of the light, so getting out of my hand is not important to them. It's just getting out of the bright lights. So there they all are. So I'm not going to go crazy looking for the cork. I just figured I would be conscious of the fact that I know that it's in here, and I know that it's got to surface eventually, so that if I do bump into anything that does resemble it, then we would try to maybe, you know, centralize it in the feeding zone and put it someplace where we'll more easily bump into it in future encounters. But if we don't find it now, it's not the end of the world. I'm not going to sweat it. These here look like they're just the shells from some mango seeds. Stem of a pumpkin, another mango seed shell. Figured maybe I would just probe through some of this material a little bit, see if I bump into anything that is a little bit bigger, because the cork, even though, you know, even though it's been in my systems, going from system to system over many years now, it's not really changed much as far as its size. So it's more or less the same size it was when it started. It might have reduced in size slightly, but very little change as far as decomposition of it. Although I have occasionally kind of been a little bit rough with it, and I chipped off a little chunk of it here and there over time, so it's only reduced in size because of rough handling, not because of the natural activity of the worm bins. But I assume that eventually at some point, you know, the material's got to give, or, you know, over time it's got to, you know, break down. So I'm inclined to just let it keep going and keep moving it with the worms from system to system over time and giving it whatever amount of time it requires to break down. But I would say at this point it's got to be going on like perhaps 4 years, 5 years or so. And even though we didn't bump into it, I'm assuming that it's got to be in here. I mean, I suppose there's always that chance that it's in the castings, and maybe I just missed it when I was moving the worms over, but I'm guessing that that seems unlikely. Oh boy. Here, there must have been a nice big mob of worms hanging out, because there was probably some sort of little food item for them to be gathering around. So that's always fun when you bump into a little section where there's a bunch of worms having a little bit of a worm party. But I think we've subjected them to enough inconvenience by me being, you know, rather inquisitive and rummaging around through their space here. I think it's time that we gave them their food and went on our merry way to let them get back to work. I think just like last time, I'm going to do the same again as I did with regards to bedding, which is not add any, you know, because the system was built quite large, with the assumption that the space would be needed due to the fact that we're placing the worms from 2 active systems into it. So I think we'll be okay with the existing bedding that's in here. You'll probably agree with me. Just from looking around, you can see that this system is built pretty large with lots and lots of available bedding for these little guys. So I think we're going to wait a little bit, wait until the level of the system drops to a point where I feel a little bit safer trying to build up the volume of the container again to compensate for what the worms have consumed and broken down. But for now, I think we're in a-okay shape as far as available bedding for the worms, because they got tons of it in here right now. So we're just going to leave them be with regards to bedding. So I think I'll just take some of this stuff over here, since there's fewer worms hanging out in it. Over here is where all the worms seem to be. That's where we were putting most of them, I think. So I figure we would use stuff that's relatively worm-free to try to cover up the frozen stuff so we don't inconvenience any little wormies getting placed onto a bunch of really chilly material, making them uncomfortable. And, I'll admit, I'm still kind of, not even so passively, still looking for that cork. I just keep kind of using my fingertips to probe around in the hopes that I might bump into it. Oh, here's some of this old stuff too. Let's try to get that over into the feeding area too, where we're expecting most of the worm action. It's just over here, like when things start getting so high up that it would really just be a matter of me accidentally skimming this large mound and accidentally just brushing it off the top, over the side, possibly on the floor or all over the table. And well, I don't need that kind of a mess to clean up. I'd rather just gracefully bring this check into an end and cover up. Let's just bring some of this somewhat dry material to the center with the plastic covering on here. Some of this drier stuff that's been a little bit neglected from being out here and being left dry might have a little bit better chance at seeing a little bit more worm action, a little bit more worm traffic by being under the plastic where the moisture has a tendency to recirculate. And as far as moisture goes in general in here, I think we're in good shape. If things were starting to feel a little bit overly dry down low, I would feel like I would probably want to compensate for moisture by spraying a little bit in here too. Here's my spray bottle. It's just a little bit clunky. The little valve just doesn't reset quite as quickly as it could. Sometimes I'll put a little cooking oil down there in there to help it rebound a little bit more quickly, so I can more quickly dispense water with this thing. But sometimes my patience runs out quickly with this thing when it's sluggish this way. So, perhaps we'll just leave the moisture situation as is. And I even had my my grit here on the ready, which I forgot to drop in with the feeding, but I guess we can always give it to them out here on the surface, right? We'll just go ahead and we'll sprinkle a little bit of pulverized eggshell out here just in case any worms come to the surface in pursuit of something like that. And here's my worm chow too, which I would have normally included down in the feeding zone as well, but maybe we'll just coat the top surface here with a little sprinkling of it as well, so that if any worms come out here to the surface, sensing the nice moisture that's recirculating beneath the plastic, they'll have a little worm chow to nibble on too. So hopefully they'll appreciate that as well. And this top covering newspaper, well, it's not holding up as good as the one that we found over in the straggler box in the nursery bin, because here there is a good bit of moisture recirculating beneath the plastic on the top covering cardboard. And because of that, I guess it's getting nibbled away by the worms. So that's cool. If it keeps getting broken down at this rate, I'll probably just end up using it as supplemental bedding down in the feeding next time and swap it out for a new one. But for now, I think this will be good enough to just continue using. And here's another little wormy on the plastic. Yeah, this is just a piece of cardboard with plastic actually, taped to it. So it's sort of a hybrid. Cardboard plastic covering with plastic. Cardboard covering with plastic wrap. All right, everyone, that's it for our check-in now with our 18-day-old red wigglers getting feeding number 2. And they look like they're doing quite nice in here. I do kind of look forward to when the material in here settles and when we could do a little bit more of a thorough check. But until the level does settle, I'm reluctant to be very, very thorough, because I feel like I'm just going to end up dumping stuff all over the place. That's all right. Someday we'll get a chance to look through here thoroughly. All right, everyone, thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.